Welcome to the Mac's Future Weekly Podcast. All Apple talk and no chit-chat.
Okay, welcome to the Apple Podcast. This is Lex at Mac's Future, and this is episode 129. And today is October 26, 2012. And boy, there's been a lot of Apple news, so let's get to it. Should be interesting. Okay, so this has been a really big week in Apple news, and the biggest part of the week really started off on Tuesday, October 23rd, when Apple had its event. It had sent out invitations a week earlier for people to go to a theater in San Jose called the California Theater, and the press was, I guess, invited there, and Apple live streamed at 10 a.m. Pacific time. It did a live video stream of the event, so you could watch it, and you could watch it if you had any Apple product like a Macintosh or an iOS device. It would work through Safari, and you could go to Apple's website and see a live version of the event. And this was a huge event because Apple basically announced a lot of new products. And, the biggest thing that it announced was the much rumored iPad mini. Apple did call it an iPad mini. That was revealed, as well as other products. Apple announced and immediately started selling a 13-inch Retina MacBook Pro. Apple also updated the Mac Mini and also updated the iMac line. And so it was a huge event. Actually, I think the order of these things was, I think it started off with the Retina MacBook Pro, then the Mac Mini, and then the iMac, and then finally the iPad minis. And, what are my impressions of this? Well, I think this is really impressive. I think that Apple, I don't think Apple's ever had so many upgrades or so many new products and upgrades all announced at one time. Oh, and I'm leaving out a big thing. Apple also shockingly announced that there's a new full version of the iPad, the 4th generation iPad, which also shocked a lot of people, as Apple had only released the 3rd generation iPad last, I want to say March. So it's been less than a year, and Apple has broken the cycle of upgrades. So this was a mammoth event. And let's go through, each of the products and sort of tell you what I think about them, because it really was sort of an epic announcement. The first product had been expected. It's the MacBook Pro Retina, and it wasn't that great a surprise it was going to come out. There'd been rumors for a while that after the Retina 15-inch MacBook Pro came out, that Apple was going to expand the whole Retina line in the Macintosh world, and the 13-inch MacBook Pro Retina is sort of expected and is very similar to the 15-inch except in the 13-inch body. Now, it's particularly significant because the best-selling Macintosh that Apple has is the 13-inch MacBook Pro. And the specs of this are pretty impressive. Basically, they got the weight of the 13-inch MacBook Pro down to 3.6 pounds. And let's see, what are the... Let's take you through some of the tech specs. Let's see, what are some of the tech specs here? Okay, so the resolution, the native resolution, is 2560 by 1600. So it gives you 227 pixels per inch. So that's pretty impressive. By comparison, the 15-inch Retina display gives you 2,880 by 1800, and actually you get a little less pixels per inch on the 15-inch. The starting price of the 13-inch Retina will be $1,699, and for that you get a 2.5 gigahertz dual-core Intel Core i5 processor with turbo boost up to 3.1 gigahertz, and what else? It has 3 megabytes of shared L3 cache. You can get a more expensive model that has for $1,999, and that can, I guess, give you a you can configure that up to a 2.9 gigahertz dual core processor. So it's a pretty sweet upgrade, and I think a lot of people who might not purchase the 15-inch Retina MacBook Pro might purchase the 13-inch. In some ways, I think it's going to be more popular. So let's see. So the Retina starts at $1,699. Now, if you select that, what do you get? Let's see. You get 128 gigabyte flash storage, and you can upgrade it to 256 for 300 more, and all the way up to 768 flash storage for 1300. You can also, if you want, upgrade it to 2.9 gigahertz. And I think in terms of RAM, you get how much RAM do you get? Oh, you get 8 gigabytes. That's the other thing that's nice about this. Both Retina display MacBook Pros, the 15-inch and the 13-inch, come with standard 8 gigabyte of RAM. Now, if you select the more expensive $1,999 one, you can... What do you get with that? I guess you get a better graphics card. I think that's the difference in price. The one at $1,699 has a 128 gigabyte flash storage and and actually the difference is I guess you get a 256 gigabyte flash storage with the $1,999 one. So, I think it's a huge upgrade. Now, it doesn't have an optical drive like the 15-inch MacBook Pro Retina. It has no optical drive, but it does have HDMI output, plus Thunderbolt, plus USB 3.0, and so that is the future. You can still buy the old-fashioned 13-inch MacBook Pro, and I think that in terms of tech specs, you get a much more powerful, I think, computer with the Retina 13-inch. Now, let's see, the weight, if you go, the difference in weight is the 13-inch regular MacBook Pro is 4.5 pounds, and the Retina one, I think I told you, it's like almost a full pound less, and also it's thinner. It's definitely thinner. So in terms of the specs, the Retina, let's see, what does it say here in terms of the specs? It's significantly thinner. So, I think we're heading towards having no optical drives and Retina displays in the Macs and flash SSD drives, and the 13-inch Retina MacBook Pro is exactly that, and it was immediately available to order on Apple's website on Tuesday the 23rd. Now, if you go to the website, it says it ships in 1 to 2 business days, so it's a pretty cool device. Another big announcement from Apple is a major update to the iMac line, and it was major even though Apple did not update them to have what are known as Retina displays. I think I think a lot of people didn't expect that the iMacs would be updated to Retina displays, simply because that would probably make the iMacs too expensive, because they have screens of 21.5 inches and 27 inches. But the big upgrade to it is that Apple found a way to make both these iMacs incredibly thin, and they showed off from the side how thin they are. Now, if you look carefully in the middle of the back where it meets the the stand, there is a little bit of a bulge, so it it isn't hyper thin everywhere, but it is super thin, and they say that it's just 5 millimeters thin at its edge. So anybody who's seen it, I haven't seen it, said it's pretty stunning. Now, they also basically have done something to improve the screen, and people who have seen the screen say that it's pretty impressive. They say they've re-engineered the screen to reduce reflection by 75%, and so that you feel closer to the action. Now, the other big thing is that they announced something known as the Fusion Drive. And what the Fusion Drive is something very clever. I don't think anyone's actually done in this way. And what Apple has done is combined either a regular hard drive with a second drive that's an SSD drive that's about 128 gigabytes. But Apple has made it so that when it works with Mountain Lion treats the SSD drive and the hard drive as one drive, and then Mountain Lion puts like your operating system or the apps that you use the most, or I guess the data that you use all the time, on the 128 SSD drive, and data or apps that you don't use as much are automatically shifted to the slower hard drive. And apparently this just changes on the fly. So Apple's claiming that this sort of combination gets you faster speeds that are almost as fast as just having it all on an SSD drive. So I haven't seen actual benchmarks, but it'll be pretty amazing if Apple can really get these speeds up to close to a pure SSD drive. Like on my iMac, I had Otherworld Computing install a second 128 SSD drive, but my operating system, Mountain Lion, views that as a second drive to the standard 1 terabyte drive. And I did put the operating system on that, but unlike what Apple's doing, it doesn't automatically move like programs that I don't use enough to the slower drive. So Apple sort of pioneered this technology that's, I think, unique. Now, there have been these drives, I think Seagate made it, where they would put like maybe 8 gigabytes or 20 gigabytes or 24 gigabytes of SSD in a hard drive and use it as a cache. But Apple's not doing it as a cache. It's basically the operating system is actually moving data and programs that are not used as much off the SSD to the hard drive. So this is pretty impressive. And Apple pretty much, I think, kept the prices of these iMacs the same. So the entry-level 21-inch iMac is $12.99, and the entry-level 27-inch iMac is $17.99. But they're not going to be available right away. It says that the 21-inch iMac will be available in November, and the 27-inch iMac won't be available until December. And to give you a sense of the processors, and the other thing that's great is that all of them come with a minimum 8 gigabytes worth of RAM for those prices. So that's really big, because 8 gigabytes is a lot, and before I think you got 4 gigabytes standard, and before you could put 32 gigabytes into the 27-inch iMacs, but it wasn't officially supported by Apple. But now Apple is officially supporting up to 32 gigabytes worth of RAM. So, this is a major upgrade, and I think a lot of people have been waiting to get their to get like a new iMac, and people who have seen this are very impressed. It has 4 USB 3.0 connections, plus 2 Thunderbolt connections, plus a gigabit Ethernet connection, plus a SDXC card slot, and plus a headphone slot. But there is no optical drive. So Apple is killing the optical drive, and I think that's a trend you're going to see. You can buy an external optical drive and go to Apple's website. It does look pretty spectacular when you look at it from the side, how thin these iMacs are. So I think a lot of design firms are going to use them because they just look so stunning. So I think this is a very welcomed upgrade, and I do think at some point in the future you will see Retina display drives. Apple also announced at that same exciting event that the Mac Mini has been updated, and the major things is that the Mac Mini now has USB 3.0 connections as well as Thunderbolt. I think it was made also thinner and got upgrades in the processor, and I do believe it also just comes with the standard 8 gigabyte configuration. No, it comes with 4 gigabytes of memory configurable to 8 gigabytes or 16 gigabytes. So the Mac Mini now can go up to 16 gigabytes. The cheapest one is $599. It's only 1.4 inches in height and 7.7 inches and 7.7 inches. And I think it's a pretty decent major upgrade. You can also get the more expensive one for $799 and configure it with 2.6 gigahertz quad-core Intel Core i7. But I think also the interesting thing with this is if you want to, you can put one of these fusion drives in there. So if you want to, you can get the cheapest 500 gigabyte standard hard drive, or put in a 1 terabyte 5400 RPM hard drive, or a 256 gigabyte solid state drive, or put in one of these combo drives, which is a solid state drive with a hard drive that's the fusion drive. So a lot of people use these as servers. A lot of people actually, there are these server farms where you buy these Mac Minis and store them off-site, and they act as your off-site server. And what else? I mean, it has one HDMI port, 1 Thunderbolt port, and 4 USB 3 ports, and an SDXC card slot, and gigabit Ethernet. So I think this is plus it has a FireWire 800 port. What's interesting is the iMacs do not have FireWire ports. So it looks like the FireWire is still in the iMac communication. So it's a pretty good update. So I think a lot of people are going to be pleased. Now, the next kind of shocker announcement at that event on the 23rd, something that some people had, hinted about or rumored about, was that Apple actually updated the full iPad line. That's the almost 10-inch iPad. Now, remember, the iPad 3rd generation came out last spring in March, I think, or early April, and basically the iPad for 2 years had always been updated in the same period that it had been initially launched in the spring. And Apple did something incredibly stunning. They updated the regular iPad Retina display, and they didn't just update it, as some people speculated, with a bump in having the Lightning connector that was introduced with the iPhone 5. No, they added a Lightning connector, but they also did something that kind of upset a lot of people who bought the 3rd generation iPad. They updated the processor so that they put in a much more powerful processor, the A6X chip, which is twice as fast as the A5X chip that Apple put in the iPad 3rd generation. And they also updated the Wi-Fi to give it faster Wi-Fi N, and they also updated the LTE cell phone data connections so that there were more LTE bands that work overseas. The 3rd generation iPad LTE only worked in the United States, and this will work in other countries. And also, I think they updated the FaceTime HD camera to give it a higher resolution, and so all of this is like a major upgrade from the 3rd generation iPad. And a lot of people are upset about it because a lot of people are like, well, why did we upgrade in March? We thought, our device was going to be the best for a year. But I think Apple is under pressure in terms of competition. I think that's one reason Apple updated it now. The other thing is, I thought it was a little weird that the iPhone 5, which came out after the 3rd generation iPad, had a better processor. It has the A6 chip, which is, the benchmarks are twice as fast as the 3rd generation iPad. Now, previously, when the iPad 2 came out, it had a better processor that ultimately went into the subsequent iPhone 4. So the thinking had been that the better processor would come out in the iPad and then go into the iPhone, but the iPhone 5 leapfrogged the previous iPad. So what I'm thinking is that maybe Apple just couldn't get its act together with the iPad 3 to develop this blazing fast processor that was going to go into the iPad 4th generation. And Apple decided to do, a sort of substitute with the A5X and the Retina display. And so why didn't they wait till the spring? And I think it's because Apple is under a lot of pressure to continue to expand the iPad in the face of competition. But also because, as we'll discuss a little later, Apple was issuing the iPad mini. And so to give people an incentive to continue to buy the larger, more powerful, and more expensive iPad, I think Apple wants to make the regular iPad have even a greater premium in terms of performance and quality over the iPad mini or over the iPad 2nd generation, which Apple continues to sell in a 16 gigabyte version. So this iPad is available to order starting 3 o'clock this morning, and it's going to be delivered, just the Wi-Fi version, on November 2nd, and sometime in, I guess, mid-November, Apple, if you could order for delivery, I guess, later in November, the LTE version. So, I'm just wondering how many people who bought the 3rd generation iPad are going to sell it to buy this 4th generation. I have a 3rd generation iPad as well as a 2nd generation iPad, and I'm not sure if I'm going to sell the 3rd generation iPad because the 4th generation iPad isn't lighter or thinner, it's just more powerful and has the Lightning connector and the overseas LTE, and frankly I don't know if I really need that. I mean, it already seems like a pretty powerful iPad and performance wise, and I have a 2-year Apple Care Plus plan on my iPad, and I guess I could transfer it if I sold it, but I don't know if it's worth the hassle. I may actually, for the full version iPad, just wait until Apple comes out with a 5th generation iPad, which could be in the spring or could be in the same time period in October of next year. So, there's a lot of changes here, and I think a lot of people are just taken by surprise by this major upgrade to the iPad. So let's go on to the next topic. Okay, so the big news, I guess Apple saved for last, was that it announced the iPad mini. And it had been long rumored that Apple was going to create a smaller version of the iPad that's bigger than the iPhone or the iPod Touch, but smaller than the iPad. And Apple did it. And it looks great. It comes in both black and white. So let's talk about the specs, because I guess that's the big thing. You know, what were going to be the specs, and including the pricing. So here's the deal. It's significantly lighter than the iPad. It's about half the weight of the iPad. The Wi-Fi version is 0.68 pounds, and the version with the LTE is 0.69 pounds. And it's definitely thinner, and its thinness is only 0.28 inches, which is significantly thinner than the iPad, and its width is 5.3 inches, and its height is 7.8 inches. And how does that compare with the regular iPad models, where they have like a nice little comparison chart? So in terms of depth, the thinness, the iPad third generation, which is thicker than the second generation or the fourth generation, is 0.37 inches in thickness, and this is 0.28 inches. Now the original, or the second generation iPad, which had been the thinnest up till then, was 0.34 inches. So this is somewhat thinner than the second and third or fourth generation iPad, and it's definitely less than half the weight of the third or fourth generation iPad, and almost half the weight of the second generation iPad. One of my complaints with the third generation iPad is that it's thicker and weighs more than the second generation iPad. So one of the reasons I've been looking forward to this iPad mini is that I do need an iPad that is thinner and lighter than the third or generation iPad. It's hard to hold without resting a third generation iPad or fourth generation iPad for a long time because of the weight and the size. And so, for example, if I'm even sitting down on the subway and holding it and reading a book, the weight does put pressure on your hands. And it would be nice to have something so light that you can hold in one hand. And frankly, I think that's why people use the smaller Kindle. It's not just because it's cheaper, but it's because it's much, much lighter. And so this iPad mini is much, much lighter. Now the interesting thing is its pixels are exactly the same as the second generation iPad. They're 1024 by 768, but instead of a 9.7 inch diagonal, they're on a 7.9 inch diagonal. So it's not hugely smaller than a full version iPad, but it's significantly lighter. And one thing I noticed is that it doesn't. Well, it does have the fingerprint resistant oleophobic coating. Now, in terms of the processor, it doesn't have the iPad third generation's or the fourth generation's A6X processor. Instead, it has the same dual-core A5 processor that the iPad 2 has, which I think is fine, and it still has the same 10-hour life. However, it does have the same good camera as the iPad 3 or the fourth generation iPad. It has the 5 megapixel photo camera, and it has the FaceTime HD camera, the same as the fourth generation. So it has a really great camera, plus it has the LTE that the fourth generation iPad has. In other words, LTE both in the United States and on LTE bands overseas. So, this is a huge release into the market. Now, in terms of price, Apple was criticized by some analysts or some people who you think they know better that the price is too high. The introductory iPad mini with 16 gigabytes in white or black and just Wi-Fi it costs $329. By comparison, the intro iPad is still $499. And some people were disappointed. They were hoping that the intro iPad mini would be priced below $300, maybe $299, maybe $250. I think either the Kindle or the Nexus is like either $200 or even less. But Apple didn't price it that low because, for a couple of reasons. I think Apple doesn't want to compete with products that are sold at cost, and and Amazon and Google have, I think, both said that they're selling those devices at cost, and I think Apple is willing to have a lower priced product but still have a margin, in other words, make a profit. So Apple, I guess, came out with this at $329. The 32 gigabyte model Wi-Fi only is $429. The 64 gigabyte model is $529, and the cellular version is $130 more at each price point. So the 16 gigabyte Wi-Fi cell version is $459. The 32 gigabyte one is $559, and the 64 gigabyte one is $659. So, it's somewhat cheaper than the full version iPad. Now, there had been some stories that one of the reasons that Apple priced the iPad mini starting at $329 is supply issues, and that it's hard for it to get enough supply of, I guess, the screens or some other components, and so it can't make as many as it would like if it sold it at a lesser price. And so, in a way, by pricing it at $329, it reflects the fact that it's a premium product and that it, it's in short supply. So basically, this went on sale along with the regular iPad at midnight on the morning of October 26th. That's this Friday, Pacific time, which means on the East Coast at 3 a.m. And I immediately purchased two of them, a black one and a white one, just with Wi-Fi for delivery on November 2nd, which is next Friday. I got just 32 gigabytes. I was tempted to just get the 16 gigabytes because they're so cheap. And I think within 20 minutes, the white one is sold out. So now there is a 2-week additional wait if you want to get the white one. And the black one has not yet been sold out. I'm looking at late in the day on the 26th. And let's see, yeah, the black one, if you want one, still delivers on November 2nd. Now, it could be that Apple just made a lot more of the black one. I can't believe that the white one is highly more popular than the black one. And I think it's going to be very popular. I don't think, even though it's like maybe $100 more than the Nexus or the Kindle Fire, I do think a lot of people are still going to be attracted to it who might not otherwise purchase the full version iPad. And then I think there's going to be people like me who have the full version iPad and who are going to want a mini iPad for those situations that they're more mobile. So, for example, at home I might use the big iPad, or at work I might use the big iPad, but maybe, for moving around and commuting, I would like the smaller iPad, to read books on the subway, or to, just when I'm going around. It's just easier to carry. The other thing is, I do think that what's exciting about the smaller iPad is that it has the cell phone data connection, because it's always been my contention that if they ever put a cell phone data connection in the iPod touches, that you could use that in lieu of an iPhone, because you could use voice over IP. And with the mobility of the iPad mini, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of people just ditch their iPhone or phone and use voice over IP with one of the data plans that Verizon or AT&T or even Sprint now are going to be providing with the iPad mini. So that's pretty exciting, because I don't think the carriers want to go to a pure old data plan. I think they want to still try to charge you more money with a with a phone plan plus a data plan. So I don't think a lot of people have talked about this, but this is kind of a breakthrough in getting devices. The more we have devices that have data plans like the full version iPad and the iPad mini, the closer we're getting to not having these ridiculously expensive phone plans from the phone companies. So to me, that's a sort of a big breakthrough. Okay, so the other big event this week was yesterday, the Thursday the 25th, after the markets closed at 4 o'clock. Apple issued its results for the fourth quarter, the quarter ending end of September 2012. And it was kind of a mixed result. I mean, it's kind of weird because Apple just keeps making phenomenal amounts of profit and growing its profit and growing its revenue. But then Wall Street sort of views it, either as a fail or a miss, even though it's making phenomenal profit. And that's because of something known as the average of the analysts' expectations. So these so-called analysts who work for securities firms, they try to guess as to what Apple's results will be. And if Apple falls short of the average of what these analysts say, then it's viewed negatively. Apple also gives guidance at the beginning of a quarter as to what it thinks it's going to be its results, and Apple blew past its guidance, and so Apple reported in this quarter's $36 billion in revenue, profit of $8.2 billion, and earnings per share of 8.67. Now, analysts on Wall Street had collectively expected $8.75 profit per share. So the 8.67 was a little lower than that. Apple had said that it expected to get $7.05. So some people took that as a as a miss, and Apple's shares sort of started going down. They had already been trading before the announcement in the low $600. They had sort of gone down over the course of a week or two. And Apple's iPad sales were a little lower than people had expected. People had expected like 15 million, and Apple sold 14 million iPads. And, some people think it's because, there were a lot of rumors that there was going to be the iPad mini and maybe an update to the Thunderbolt port to the iPad. So maybe some people were holding off in September and August, waiting to get an updated iPad. But overall, there is growth here. For example, the sales of almost $36 billion is 27% greater than what its sales were in the same quarter last year. Its profit is 24% greater than last year. Its earnings are up 23% from last year. The iPhone sales were up something like a whopping 57.6% compared to last year. And the iPad sales were up 26%. The Macintoshes weren't up much in that quarter. They were only up 0.7%. But for the whole PC industry, the PC industry sales were down 8%. So compared to the whole PC industry, the Macintosh sales were very robust. So what else? The Apple TVs sold 1.3 million units. That was a 100% increase from the year before. And Apple Store revenue was up 18%. And the total stores that they have are 390, including 140 outside the United States. And they also announced a new dividend per share, which is going to be $2.65 per share, which is going to be payable on November 15th. Now, what's interesting is for the first quarter of the next fiscal year, Apple gave guidance that the revenue for the quarter is going to be $52 billion, but that the earnings is only going to be $11.75 billion. And Apple generally beats its guidance, so there's a good chance that the revenue will be in excess of $52 billion and in excess of $11.75. But surprisingly, Apple said that its gross margin is going to go down. Currently, it's still like around 40% gross margin, and Apple's saying that in the coming quarter it's going to go down to 36%. And there was some explanation given during the conference call, and we'll go into that. Now, what's remarkable is that Apple's cash and marketable securities is now 121 billion, 0.25. So it has an incredible amount of cash in the bank. So that's pretty phenomenal. Now at 5 o'clock yesterday, Apple held a scheduled conference call to discuss the results. It started off with investor relations person from Apple, Nancy Paxton, discussing that CFO Peter Oppenheimer and Tim Cook would be on, as well as the treasurer. Oppenheimer started off just talking about the overall results of revenue, this is what he said about the details of the quarter. He said, "I'd like to begin with our Mac products and services. We sold over 4.9 million Macs, establishing a new September quarter record." And he pointed out this was 1% growth year over year compared to 8% contraction in the PC market. And he basically pointed out that the sales of the portable Macintoshes grew 9% year over year, thanks to strong sales of the MacBook Pro and MacBook Air. So it's those as opposed to the iMacs that are the big sellers. What else does he say? He said, the iPod line is continuing to shrink. So, for example, now they only sold 5.3 million iPods compared to 6.6 million a year ago. So, look, the iPod was the cash cow for Apple, and basically it's slowly bleeding out because the reality is you have an iPod in the iPhone, in the iPad, in the iPad mini, and the iPod Touch. So the question is, why do you need this sort of standalone iPod? Let's see. In terms of the iPhone, they pointed out that the demand has been phenomenal, and pointed out that the iPhone 5 was launched in 9 countries on September 21st and 22 more on September 28. And he said that they had $9.1 million iPhones in channel and inventory. Now here's what's interesting: the iPhone handset and accessory sales was 17.1 billion during the quarter compared to 11 billion a year ago, which is 56% increase. And that a lot of people are using the iPhone in the enterprise. So I think they really emphasize that the iPhone is now being used in various businesses. And they gave an example in the conference call that Canon, the big company, has provided iPhones to salespeople for secure access to its customer relations management system. They emphasize that Amtrak has deployed thousands of iPhones to train conductors, and that they use it to validate tickets, that the BBC and other journalists are using it, to take videos. Journalists take videos and send it back. So, I think they're looking to penetrate the enterprise now with the iPhone. Now, on the conference call, they gave examples of how enterprise is using iPad. For example, they said that Volkswagen has developed more than 30 in-house apps for vital processes across the company, including monitoring and tracking of vehicles on the production line. They said Ping, an insurance company in China, has developed thousands of iPads in their sales agents, has deployed thousands of iPads to the sales agents. They said that apps developed in-house are used by car accident inspectors to carry out on-site inspections involving claims, which shorten the processing time and improve customer satisfaction. They gave an example in Brazil. Banco Bradesco is using iPads to redefine the customer experience in their bank branches. They said that Bradesco is using iPads to redefine the customer experience. They say on completing customer transaction, the employees at that bank use the iPad to inform and educate the customers about banking services, and Bradesco apps are in the App Store. And they said combining the iPhone, the iPad, and iPod Touches, Apple sold 45 million iOS devices in the September quarter. The App Store now has 700,000 apps and 250,000 apps specifically for the iPad. In terms of iOS 6, they pointed out that Apple launched iOS 6 last month, and already it's on over 200 million devices. And, so that's a pretty big metric. Now, in terms of the guidance for the coming quarter, during the conference call, they made the following points. They pointed out that last year, that same quarter, the first quarter ending in December, had 14 weeks just because of the way the calendar worked. But this year, like normal years, Apple will only have 13 weeks in the quarter. So when people are looking to compare the projected profit to last year's projected profit, Apple's dealing with a quarter that's 1 week shorter. Apple said, as we indicated previously, revenue in the 14th week last year was approximately 1/14 of the quarter's total revenue. We expect revenue to be about $52 billion compared to $46.3 billion in the December quarter last year. And it goes on to say, we expect gross margin to be about 36%, reflecting approximately $90 million related to stock-based compensation expenses. So what's interesting is the gross margin may be lower, not because of like the physically building things cost more, but because of the cost of stock-based expenses to employees. So in the conference call, I guess Peter Oppenheimer gave other reasons why the gross margin could go down in the next quarter. And that, by gross margin, again, I mean how much profit it makes on each dollar. And it basically pointed to the fact that it was releasing so many new upgrades to new form factors of its devices, including the iPhone 5, the iPad mini, the iMac, the MacBook Pro, and the iPod Touch and the iPod Nano. And it says there are costs associated with such dramatic change in demand, pointing out these new form factors really can affect the cost. So what happens is the margin becomes greater the more it makes, because there's additional cost, and if you spread it out over more devices made and sold, then you lower the cost, I guess, just through sheer numbers. And it says here the difference this time is the sheer number of new products we are introducing in a very short period of time. And it goes on to say also maybe one of the reasons the margin is going down is we lowered the price of the iPhone 4S and 4, delivering incredible value to our customers. So in other words, the overall price of those phones, which are still being sold in our prior generations, are lowered. And Apple probably thinks that a lot of people are going to buy those phones instead of the iPhone 5. And so that cuts into the margin. And so we'll have to see if Apple's margin goes down. This is something that the street looks at in terms of, it likes the fact that Apple has this tremendous margin, which is 40%. By contrast, a company like Amazon maybe has like a 1% margin, or even this quarter it announced that it was losing money. So, it's kind of weird. Everybody expects Apple to be such an incredible performer that even if it performs incredibly well, the stock market thinks it should perform even better, which is kind of ridiculous, I think. Now, how will Apple do in the next quarter, which is the quarter ending December 31st? Now, personally, I think Apple's going to have a phenomenal quarter. And why do I say this? I say this, and one disclaimer here, I own Apple stock, okay? So I don't mean this as a price prediction or anything like that. This is just my own personal view. But I do think that Apple is going to have a great quarter, and here's why. Last year, Apple didn't have such a great quarter for the fourth quarter ending in September 30th, 2011. Its total revenue was $28,027,000. But for the quarter ending in December, Apple had unbelievable revenue and unbelievable profit, and it just blew away everybody's expectations. So, for example, last year in the fourth quarter, the quarter ending in September, Apple had 28.27 of revenue, and then in the first quarter ending after the Christmas holiday, it had 46.3 billion. And then its profit went from 6.62 billion to 13.06 billion, more than double the quarter before. And Apple's being conservative now and saying it's going to have 52 billion and 11 billion. But one of the reasons Apple's quarter ending in December last year did so phenomenally well is because 50% or something like that of Apple's revenue comes from the iPhone, and Apple updated the iPhone from the iPhone 4 to the iPhone 4S. And even though a lot of people thought it was a minor update because the form factor of the 4S looked like the iPhone 4, it sold like crazy. So here's the thing. And that was pretty much the only main thing that Apple upgraded, right? And this year, Apple did upgrade the iPhone 5 just before the quarter started, like 9 days before October 1st. And so, but the iPhone 5 is a completely new phone. It's not the same form factor as the iPhone 4S. It's longer, it's incredibly lighter, it's incredibly thinner, and it's much more powerful than the iPhone 4S. And it has something that people have been wanting to have for a long time, LTE, which is a much faster network. So it's a much greater upgrade from the 4S than the 4S was from the iPhone 4. So you would think that would just drive sales even greater. And obviously it's on more networks. But here's another thing. Apple has also upgraded the iPad to the iPad 4, fourth generation, and released the iPad mini. Plus, Apple has updated the most popular Macintosh, the MacBook Pro Retina 13-inch. Plus, Apple has updated the iMacs, which are selling in November and December. So this is all before Christmas. Apple has all these crazy product lines all selling in this quarter. And Apple tends to sell more of a device in the quarter that it comes out, which is natural in that a new product comes out, people rush to buy it. Obviously, when it first comes out, that quarter is going to be bigger for that device than later quarters. So essentially, you have almost all of Apple's product line being upgraded either right before this quarter or in this quarter. So that's an incredible firepower. So it's possible, Apple said 51 billion in revenue. Wow, I mean, if you think about it, it's possible Apple could have 60 billion or 70 billion in revenue compared to the 46.33 billion in revenue it had last year. And instead of 11 billion in profits, as Apple conservatively projects, it's possible that Apple's going to have, maybe 15 billion in profits or 20 billion in profits. I mean, that would be just unbelievable. So I do think Apple's going to have a phenomenal quarter, unless something else happens, like, that we go into a massive recession or depression. But it does raise another issue. What is Apple going to do after this quarter? Because if it updates all these products, what is it going to have that's new in the coming year? Because Apple likes to spread out in the past the new products. In other words, the iPhone in the fall, the iPad in the spring, the Macs in the spring through the summer. And now Apple's putting all these new products in one massive quarter. Maybe they just want to have a blowout quarter. Maybe they want Apple stock to go up from the, right now it's like about 600 and it had been a little over 700. Maybe this will propel Apple stock into some other stratosphere. Or maybe Apple has some other products that are going to be launched in the spring. But I'm not sure if there's any products that could be as compelling as the iPhone or the iPad. Even if Apple launched a TV, a true TV, I read somewhere that the entire TV industry is only worth like $30 billion in the United States. So I do think it's very curious that Apple has stacked so many upgrades in such a concentrated period. It's almost like Apple really wants this quarter, the quarter before Christmas, to explode. And it does beg the question, will Apple introduce an iPad 5? Maybe Apple will now update the iPad twice a year, in the spring and the fall. So maybe we'll see an iPad 5th generation in the spring. Maybe Apple needs to do that to keep the product fresh in the face of the Android competition. After all, the Android market is constantly updating. There's all these people making Android or tablet devices, and maybe Apple feels now that it can't just upgrade the iPad once a year. Maybe Apple feels that it needs to upgrade the iPad twice a year. In other words, as it makes new technology, maybe Apple feels it needs to stuff it into the iPad or now the iPad mini and release upgrades twice a year. I do think there was a period of time where Apple, with other devices like the Mac, maybe was a little more frequent than once a year. So my opinion is that it really is going to be a tremendous quarter. So we'll have to see. Now, one place that Apple can continue to have growth in is the iPhone by getting into new markets. And Mac Rumors reports today on Friday, October 26, something the Economic Times reported, that the iPhone 5 is launching in India on November 2nd, a week from today. And apparently there had been a rumor about that. And, Apple really does need to go into new markets. So one of the problems with India is that the distribution is sort of many levels, and many different distributors, before it gets to the customer, take a cut of distributing the iPhone. And so that prevents Apple sort of from getting any decent profit. And I'm not sure how they solve that. Apparently, also the iPhone 5 will be launching in Bulgaria, Malta, Romania, and Thailand, and Greece. So Apple's looking in many different countries. So maybe smaller countries it wasn't looking at before. Apple, the problem with Apple faces is that it's so massive. Everyone hopes that it'll continue to grow. That where are you gonna squeeze those additional sales from? Where are you gonna get the additional customers? So Apple's looking into every market now, it seems. Now, Apple on Tuesday quietly released some updates to some apps, and the most notable is Final Cut Pro X. It released version 10.0.6, and it added a lot of the pro features that the pros complained about when Apple went to the dramatic update of Final Cut's, 7 to Final Cut Pro X. A lot of pros complained that a lot of features were cut out. So here are some of the important pro features that were added. Expanded multi-channel audio files directly in a timeline for precise editing or individual audio channels. Unified import window for transferring media, both file-based cameras and folders of files. Redesign the share interface for exporting projects and range selections to one or more destinations. There's now Red Camera support with native Red Code RAW editing. Red Camera is the very high-definition camera that's very popular. There's MFX plugin support that allows you to work natively with MX files. There's dual viewers, so that each with a video scope display, so you can compare shots to match action and color. And there's the option to add chapter markers in the timeline for export to video files, DVD, Blu-ray discs. There's a range selection now, preserves start and end points in the event browser. And it goes on. There's additional features such as XML 1.2 feature metadata import. So the point is that Apple's hasn't abandoned the Pro market. It wants to make Final Cut Pro X a truly professional application. I mean, I use it. I'm not a professional, but I like it a lot, and I think it's powerful, and I think it's a great update. So anyways, that quietly slipped in, and I think it's important. Okay, so that's it for the Apple Podcast, episode 129. And remember, this is a chit-chat free program all about Apple News, Apple devices, and you can support it by giving it a positive review in the iTunes Store or checking out the YouTube video, and any sort of positive feedback would be greatly supported. So hopefully see you next time. This is Lex signing out.
This has been a Max Future production.